You are now listening to You Heard.
Today's episode, we are going to be going over healing from your trauma. This is a subject that we have touched upon in the past, specifically with Karla, to talk about how she herself has healed from trauma in her past, and to have a conversation about what the steps of healing from trauma look like, and how it is all played out, how it is not pretty, but being able to create some tools and awareness in regards to tackling the trauma that we have in our lives.
The first thing that I really would say about my trauma was that the reason why I was so tied to my trauma and unaware of my trauma to an extent was because it was so intrinsically tied to my the personality or my sense of self and being a survivor. Because all of the things that I survived, overcame, all of the challenges that I was able to overcome to a great degree were rooted in trauma. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, because trauma does such a good job at hiding itself, I began to identify my trauma with my personality of enduring, right, and my personality of achieving, that I really wasn't able to identify it as trauma until what I would consider, I guess, late in the game. You know, that's really a personal determination, because it's different for everybody, and that ruler, mm-hmm. which you measure your own development, is personal to everybody. But I think I became aware of there's something wrong in my early 20s. Okay. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I ignored myself in a lot of ways. Like, I got tired and angry of being the way I was. And I think that the reason that I later on understood was because the mechanisms that I developed to survive my trauma were the mechanisms that began to hinder my growth, my personal growth, my achievements. They became the things, the things that I constructed to help me survive, mm-hmm. were the things that began choking me, ultimately. And because they were so rooted in who I was and my sense of being a badass and achieving and getting it done and being a go-getter and being ambitious, were so rooted in my trauma, mm-hmm. that I was unable to, one, identify them, and two, begin to get rid of them. Right. Because how could I get rid of all of these things that made me so great? Mm-hmm. In the perspective of the world, my trauma made me productive. Yeah. My trauma made me valuable to, where I was getting educated, or the organizations that I was a part of, mm-hmm. or even work. Like, my trauma made me valuable, and it made me effective. And what it did not make me was a happy person. And I needed to start placing more value on my own happiness before I even gave myself a chance to resolve my trauma.
The point that you made this comment of how trauma made you valuable, and you said in education, and it brought me back to our applying to college days, where it was literally told to people like us, a low income, single parent household, blah, 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 to use your trauma to gain access to scholarships, to gain access to go to fancy private or very well-known Ivy League institutions, to be a part of different kinds of leadership organizations. Like, we were constantly, put in these positions of because of your trauma, you don't have access to X, Y, and Z. So use your trauma to get where you need to go. And I think at some point in time, yes, you want to have doors open for you, but what are the consequences of opening those doors when your ticket into those doors is your trauma?
Yeah. It's your currency.
It's your currency, and you're being asked to live and define everything you do from that trauma. And the only thing I can think of is being in college. I went to a predominantly white institution that was also like 70% upper class. Like these people were coming from household that made upwards of like $110,000 a year. Like I don't even have friends that come from those kinds of households, kinds of things. So it was, the community was different, the vibe was different, and every year I felt I was in this position where I needed to use my trauma to overcome, to be seen, to be heard, to be the president of my multicultural sorority, to be involved in different kinds of like student organizations that was all about advocating for the oppressed and the this and the that, and to be the voice and champion of my community who was, you know, so small on this extremely kind of like detached from reality student body. And I remember my freshman year, like crying to my mom all the time, exhausted from having to use my trauma to be seen and heard and to navigate my educational career.
Yeah.
And then when I graduated, I was back in my trauma. I remember like being home for the first time. I just finished graduating and it was like I never left. Like time froze, the drama, the craziness, the financial struggles, the emotional baggage was all still there. But I was sold this dream while I was in high school by these colleges and these programs that if I, you know, token the trauma and experiences that I had throughout my life, that I will be able to gain all these gifts and happiness, and because all these doors were open for me. But I found that all these doors were open for me and were asking me to live in my trauma day to day. And when I was no longer being groomed and appreciated for my trauma, and I was forced to just live in it as an adult or just out of college, it was horrible and depressing, because now it was like I'm no longer using this to like fuel me to get a degree or fuel me to get a fancy job with a title. I had all of that, but I was empty. I was depressed. I used to have anxiety attacks all the time. I remember breaking down in my room so many times because I felt the world just made no sense to me. Mm-hmm. I didn't fit into it. I was making all of this money and I didn't know where I was going. And it's not like I was, you know, wasting it on things and like buying cars or houses. It was money to take care of the household that I came from. And I felt obligated to add to the cycle that I came from of survival rather than thriving. And it was because, again, the currency that I use and the ticket that I used to open this door to change, you know, quote unquote, to change the situation and the trauma that I came from and the trauma that my family was in was putting me back into the same thing. I was getting back to where I was before. And it had to end. There had to be a point where I no longer was using my trauma to fuel my being.
Yeah, exactly. So when your trauma becomes the engine and the fuel for your life, it becomes the single most important identifier of your personality. Mm-hmm. And it's like a self-perpetuating cycle. Like, you are this traumatized being, and if you keep using it as currency, it becomes your primary form of identifying yourself. It's like, I am this traumatized individual. I've had it so bad. My environment was horrible. I've been wronged in so many ways, mm-hmm. that you have to kind of come up with this way of making it okay, yeah. Or you will destroy yourself. Mm-hmm. So for me, I didn't get depressed about it. I got proud about it, which was, you know, almost also as damaging, yeah. as getting depressed about it, because it became so intrinsically tied to what moved me forward. But I think in order to start healing, I needed to do two things. And the first was remove myself from the environment, which you didn't get a chance to do, given that you went back home after college. And for me, once I left for college, I never came back into the household until my mother got sick. So I wasn't in the family home. I was removed from it. And it was very much during that time where I began to notice that there was something wrong. So I had to be removed from the environment that traumatized me in the first place, which was, you know, my environment at home, like the back home, like the family dynamic, the whatever made me traumatized. I had to be removed from it. But number two, what being able to go to college on that scholarship, on that like path of achievement gave me in terms of my trauma, more than it took away, it gave me the luxury of having disposable time and income to even have the ability to start to deal with to even have that time to think about my trauma. Because if you're in the same environment that you were traumatized under, you're never going to like have a space to fight it or to resolve it or to even identify it. You're always going to be in it. You can't sit in the trauma that you were in and solve it. It's, at least I think it's very difficult. I've not heard of someone actually doing it that way. And number two, you have to have, it's a luxury to be able to resolve trauma. It absolutely is. And it's not available to a lot of people. And that was part of my own healing and being able to understand my mother's own trauma, like her trauma, is that she was not able to resolve it or to deal with it because she honestly just did not have the disposable time and energy to even begin to question her trauma. It was like, if you are in an environment and in a time and place and situation in your life where your primary focus is survival, putting food on the table, keeping like rent paid, keeping kids clothed, like keeping people safe, you are never going to be able to do anything with your trauma because it's unavailable. Like that is unavailable to you. That is a commodity that is unavailable to you because the majority of the world lives in these spaces where their immediate, almost survival needs need to be taken care of. And, you know, at least I can say that much for like using my trauma to get me into college is that it gave me enough resources to have the few moments that I was able to gather to even begin to question like why it is, to even be annoyed with myself. I don't even think that like our mothers in the struggle that they were with or under even had that luxury, because it is a luxury to do that. And I was able to understand that as you know, I moved through it. But that understanding came to me specifically because the first physical and conscious time where I was able to like say or to move forward in my healing, I was on a vacation. Like I was out and about and not thinking about my food, my rent, my anything, that I was like able to pinpoint, oh, like, you know, here is where it is. Yeah. So like the first step comes at like identifying, like being aware. First of all, not even identifying, just being aware. Yeah. You are a traumatized person. And I think for the majority of this world,
they don't notice.
I mean, but we're all traumatized people. And you know, it might have nothing to do with your loving parents or your family situation or your background. The world in and of itself
is traumatizing.
Yes, because we've built it as a species, as a traumatizing event for everybody that lives here. So getting through that first step of saying I am a traumatized person is a huge thing, because for me, I fought so hard to not be traumatized. Yeah. because I had all of these horrible things that were happening. So I disguised my trauma as this great thing. Like I said, that made me a survivor, that made me a go-getter, that made me an achiever. And I did such a good job of hiding my own trauma from myself that I was unable to identify it, because it meant that, like, it created me, and because I didn't want to be created on this base of, like, horrible things, I said horrible things happened, but it made me all of these great things.
Yeah.
When in and of itself, those things were also traumatizing. And then came the next part of not only being able to acknowledge I was traumatized, but then beginning to identify what traumatized me, which I did, like I mentioned, on that one trip that I began to do it on that one trip where I was at leisure.
Yeah.
And I was able to do that.
So the point that you made about, like, leaving the traumatic environment and having the privilege and the luxury to have time, from my own personal experiences, it took me to literally pick up and leave and move to a completely different part of the country, to be so far removed from the traumatic environment and have the time to embrace my trauma, not as something that I wanted to continue to use as my currency, but something that I wanted to heal from and grow from and break a lot of the generational cycles and the generational trauma that has been passed down in my family. And in my journey of doing that, I was constantly brought back to my childhood. What happened in my childhood that shifted this isn't traumatic to now this is traumatic. And I often, when doing the healing that I do now, which I know that I have tons to do, I always come back to the idea of working with my inner child, because I felt like my trauma came from the fact that I wasn't even able to be a child for very long, and I really don't have much recollection of what my childhood looked like, because there was so much pressure on me to perform X, Y, and Z, to be in charge of myself and all these different kinds of things within the household because my mom wasn't around. And, you know, what that looked like to be pigeonholed into being so self-sufficient, and how, yes, that has gotten me so many different kinds of accolades and opportunities, and like you said, has granted me the privilege and time to now, as an adult, process this, but also, like, hurt me in the long run, because I don't have space to allow myself to think or approach life as a child. Like, I can't remember a soft time in my life. Like, everything was so hard, and everything always had to be something to overcome. And once I finally moved, it was crazy to think about how I didn't have to have pressure anymore. And it was crazy to think about I can lead a life that didn't feel stressful, that didn't feel like I was on eggshells, that didn't feel like I needed to carry the whole world on my back to pay back and save all of the people that got me to where I was. That there were ways for me to create happiness, not just for myself, but for my loved ones, without sacrificing myself and again, kind of just like living in this trauma. So I was able to really step out and to look at who I was as a child and try to heal this like little kid's soul into being like, it's gonna be okay. You have the tools to get through this, and we're going to heal together. Like, there's this whole other person that's within me that I'm trying to learn, that wasn't able to grow, that I'm now trying to create a relationship with in order for me to like fully love myself, I don't want to just love the traumatic part of me. I want to love the part of me that just didn't get a chance to live, but now has the time and opportunity to be born and like live the life that she was unfortunately robbed of because of the situation.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up your inner child, because I think that my inner child was the first person that made me aware of what really was my trauma. Because in the same trip that I mentioned earlier, and granted, this trip didn't happen very long ago. It was January of 2017 where I took this trip. So I was aware that there was something wrong since my early 20s until like 2017. But it took me that long to actually identify what was at the root cause of a lot of my trauma, because I wasn't letting like my inner child speak, I guess it would be a way that I put it. And the reason it came about was because a friend, we were literally on a leisurely walk on our vacation, and a friend asked me a question, and I answered as the person I was then, my very like surface, almost defense mechanism answer that I would, but inside of my head, somebody else answered the question very honestly. And it was almost a moment where I was like, who said that? Like, who the fuck said that? Because me, who I am, who I've constructed myself to be through my trauma, would have never said that or admitted that or verbalized that. But there was a little girl inside of me that was 3 years old that was like, hey, I'm still here. Yeah. And she answered. And I was completely taken aback because I was unaware that this person, like you said, it's almost like another person exists inside of you that was somehow stopped or cut short or, you know, not given a chance or whatever. And they are still in there. And you have to bring them to a place of resolution and peace so that you can move forward with your growth. And for me, it was that moment where I was like, literally, who the fuck said that in my head? Like, why would I ever said that? And it wasn't me. It was this person who this trauma did occur to. And she was like, hey, I'm still here. Yeah. Like, you still need to address me. Unfortunately, because of the person that I was, I did not take the opportunity at that time to actually address the issue because I wasn't ready for it. And just out of stubbornness, out of grounding myself in the belief of who I wasn't going to deal with it. I knew it was there. It was in the back of my mind always. And I knew I had to come back to it. But I did not take the opportunity to do it then. But God, the universe, and, you know, the powers that be have a plan for us. And that was January. In June and July of that same year, my mom gets diagnosed with terminal cancer. Right. And at that point, I had a deadline at that point to resolve my trauma. Yeah. Because unfortunately for me, a lot of that like had to do with my mother. And so if I wanted to be okay after she had passed, if I wanted to use her as a resource to resolve the trauma, if I even wanted accountability from her before she passed, I had a deadline to be able to resolve that trauma. But I had to make a commitment to resolving my trauma that I almost had the luxury of ignoring before. Because everybody has that luxury of just setting aside their trauma and being like, I'm not going to deal with you. Yeah. Because I have other things to do. Right. I have shit to get done and I can't deal with you. But for me, you know, one of the blessings that came from the experience that I had with my mother's illness was that it forced me to bring myself to a point of resolution with all of the trauma that I had with her. And it was absolutely necessary for me, my sanity, and actually my life to be able to do it, because I was not going to make it past her passing if I didn't do this. So I had the time and the privilege because of, the money I was able to save, the job I was able to have, etc., to sit at her bedside for 2 years.
Yeah.
And to literally, for 24 hours and 7, days a week, deal with it. And a lot of people don't have that privilege.
No.
But it was, I'm grateful. I'm super grateful for that experience. Because coming out of this experience of healing, I can say that I'm at peace. And I guess that's what you get out of resolving trauma.
Right.
It's this sense of peace. It's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely, almost, what's the word? Nerve-wracking and very frustrating to heal.
Yeah.
Especially when you're someone like us, whose personality is grounded on trauma and whose value was once grounded on trauma. Once you heal and you let go of that trauma, you also let go of the things that made you valuable and ambitious and a go-getter. Because if your personality is grounded on trauma, once you get rid of it, you have a blank slate.
Right.
And that is scary as can be. And the other thing is that healing yourself is not easy.
No.
It is literally the most painful thing that I've ever had to do. It's self-surgery. And it's surgery without any anesthesia. And you have to sit there and literally cut into yourself to actually identify the problem. And the reason, I know that when I talked to you about this, probably the first time, I told you that it was like popping a blister.
Yeah.
First time that I became aware of all of this, on that vacation that I was on, I had all these blisters on my feet from walking around in these uncomfortable shoes. And it became this metaphor, analogy to the trauma that I was trying to hide from myself. Because if you think about it, when a blister forms, is your body's defense mechanism against irritation. And your trauma is that irritation. So your body reacts to it by wrapping it in this bubble of protective liquid that is going to cushion you and yourself from feeling this pain, which is what you do with trauma. You try to surround it, mask it, encase it in this comfortable cushion so that you don't feel the pain because of it. And once you do have that blister, in order to heal it quickly, you have to just say, this is a blister.
Right.
And then be okay with causing yourself harm by popping it and allowing it to be raw and allowing it, and allowing it to hurt and then heal.
Yeah.
And no longer be this blister, cushiony, defense mechanism that you use to get rid of irritation, which trauma is a lot more than irritation. But to me, at the time, during that walk, it made sense to make it like that. But it is absolutely horribly painful.
The idea of popping the blister, that releasing the water, which I know is water is something that I personally use in my process of healing, of, cleansing myself, so on and so forth. So I definitely use and visualize that the blister effect, quote unquote, in my idea of what healing looks like. You touched upon how having healed from your trauma or different parts of your trauma, that you were able to create peace for yourself, and you had peace within yourself and with, in your life. I know that when I was in the, probably the darkest part of my trauma, again, this was right after I graduated from college and was in this space of I did all of this stuff to essentially no longer have to champion this trauma. So why am I still in it? We just moved down here, and I was in I am in a relationship, but at that point I was in a relationship. It was our first time moving in with each other. And when it comes to my partner, for anybody that knows us and knows our relationship, I very much see him as my peace. And the reason why our love works and the reason why that we work is because in the middle of a storm that I very much can be as an individual, he is the peace that I have always sought out in my life. But when I had this time to recognize that I was traumatized and to begin working on my healing, I had to no longer relinquish the control of having peace to somebody else. I couldn't just have someone else provide peace for me. I had to provide that for myself. And having grown up, having lived, 2+ decades of my life, not even beginning to really understand peace, like I can spell it and that's about it. Like that's literally how I felt. It was hard as fuck to visualize what peace even meant and looked like for me. And like you, I was given a deadline. We got pregnant, and the number one thing that you and I have always talked about, that my partner and I always talked about, is that there is a lot of trauma that we've went through that we don't want to pass down to our kids. And I know that you've experienced this with me. There were plenty of times throughout my pregnancy that I would literally feel like a sense of doom and anxiety and like just not be able to like see the light of day because I was so worried about passing down the generational trauma of my family to my daughter. I tried so hard to not be a victim of my trauma or to create a space for my daughter through my trauma from the moment that she was conceived and I knew about her to, when she was physically out of my body. There wasn't a moment where I thought to myself of how can I approach my life differently? How can I talk differently, walk differently, dress differently, eat differently, to guarantee that she will never have to feel the way that I have felt, my mother has felt, my grandmother has felt, my great-grandmother, so on and so forth. I do not want to pass it down. Like, how the fuck do I cleanse myself of it? And going through that was traumatizing in itself, of like just pinpointing all of these things within me that's in my blood, and yes, very much made me who I am and all of this greatness, but wasn't healthy. And you and I have spoken about this, and I've spoken about this with my friends who are now, considering having kids and stuff like that. We all grew up very similar in many different aspects and have very similar trauma, much like you and I. How do we pass down some of the great skills and tools and aspects of ourselves that are very much are a product of our trauma to our children without actually traumatizing them? I had this conversation with a good friend of mine who was kind of open to putting his future kids in a struggle in order to get them to understand certain aspects of life that he learned through the struggle. And it's like, I get what you're saying. And yes, these are important things that we want our children to have. But it is our duty in healing ourselves to figure out how to teach our kids these things without having to traumatize them, to get them to understand these valuable aspects of being strong, of loving yourself, of prioritizing things, of, doing X, Y, and Z, of, thriving instead of surviving, et cetera, et cetera. Like, our goals as individuals should not be, how do I pass down trauma to create greatness?
I definitely struggle with this question, especially now that it isn't just a theory and it's not just a idea conversation that we're having, and there's an actual human being that is dependent upon the resolution to these questions. Your daughter, who I am her godmother, and I am responsible for also being part of her life and raising her and instilling her with some values, some lessons. I began to question kind of my own understanding of what's valuable in my own experience. And the reason that I did that is because I came to this conclusion that what ultimately I think causes generational trauma is that people are unable to reevaluate outside of the environment in which they were taught these things, or this value came out of. Meaning that, we find these lessons valuable because it's what got us to survive our environment. But our children and your daughter won't be living in that same environment. At least that's our hope, that she will not be anywhere near the environment that we grew up in. And so we need to reconsider if our valuable lessons would even pose any kind of value to her experience, because it's two completely different scenarios. And perhaps in determining that value and teaching her that way, we are in fact selecting what her story will be for her and predetermining the limitations of her own experience. And I think I see that in the way that, for example, my mother raised me. Mm-hmm. She raised me to be able to handle and value certain things through the orientation of her experience. And that caused me trauma. And the same thing with her. Her mother raised her under the understanding of value in terms of her experience, my grandmother's experience, which was unavailable for my mother to live because it was a different time, it was a different place, it was a different set of circumstances. So that caused trauma in trying to force the parameters of a person's experience to match up with yours. You are indeed causing trauma. So I question what I believe was originally valuable to a child's experience because I am not aware of the parameters of the reality that they're going to be experiencing, because it's not my experience, it's theirs. Mm-hmm. So does Cecilia, do my children really need to learn how to be thick-skinned?
Right.
Do they need to learn how to be hard asses? Do they need to learn how to be outspoken to the degree that, they're yelling at someone's face their beliefs like we were forced to because of our own background? I don't know.
What you said reminds me of a story that my partner just finished telling me not too long ago. So our midwife invited him and other fathers to come to the birthing center and have their daddy and midwife time last Sunday, I believe. And in response to trauma that she just went through with losing her eldest daughter to suicide, she posed the question to the fathers that were there: what are you going to do as a father to protect your daughter and teach your daughter how to protect herself in this world? And I asked my partner, what was his response and what were other fathers' responses. And I found it so not surprising that all of the dads were like, she's going to learn how to box and how to do martial arts. And his response was, well, I was a wrestler and her mom, did mixed martial arts for many, many years, all of this other stuff. And it was just all about like being physically strong. And to what you're saying, which is so much of what I worry about as a mom on a day-to-day basis in regards to my daughter, is I'm not worried about whether or not she can throw a punch, take a punch, kick somebody, whatever. Like, yes, those things are important in any case that she is in a physical altercation and she needs to defend herself. But what she's probably going to go through more on a day-to-day basis is the inevitable trauma and pain that comes with being a human and living on this earth. And how the real question that our midwife was asking was, what are you going to do as a father to prepare your daughter to deal with some of the mental anguish that we go through as humans? How are you going to teach your daughter how to process the shit she's going to go through, rather than going down this deep, dark hole that her daughter went through and, had a mental illness to the point that she felt that she couldn't live anymore? What are you going to do as a father, as a parent of a daughter, to prepare them to process what is happening to them? And so, yes, very much to what you are saying, whether it's our children, our godchildren, somebody else's children, whatever role we have when it comes to the next generation, it is our duty to help them create tools to process the shit that is going to happen in life, to take a breath, to take a step back, and to put themselves first, rather than responding to their trauma and all of who they are is just a consequence of their trauma.
Absolutely, because the hardest hits that you're ever going to take in life, or the hardest punches that you're ever going to take in life, are not going to be physical. And the important part is learning how to deal with those instead of, the actual physical altercation that's going to give you bodily harm, because you heal from bruises a lot faster than you heal from your trauma. So I think in my own understanding and thinking of it, what becomes most important is kind of giving your kids the tools to recognize where they're at, like the environment that they are at, and evaluating that and adjusting to that environment, because you don't want them to continue to operate in one certain level if their environment has completely changed. Like I said, with my own experience of remaining in trauma when I didn't need to. Mm-hmm. And I think the second valuable thing that we can provide to our children, now that we've gained this, because we had to gain it, we weren't provided this as children, was that luxury of having that space to reflect, to take a moment to evaluate ourselves and be with ourselves and really hold the integrity of our self and well-being to the highest of standards and priorities. Mm-hmm. And giving our children that space, that environment that will allow them to be those people that can sit with themselves and say, I am okay, or I am not okay.
Right.
And this is how I go about making it better for myself. Because even if we don't try to traumatize them, or by some miracle we don't, the world and all that is out there, and sometimes chemical imbalances that you're unable to work with or check for or anything like that, are going to cause anguish and stress and trauma. So what's important is them having that space to self-evaluate and be aware and say, I'm not okay. And I have the time and space and ability to find a path forward from this and heal. Because that is the ultimate luxury that I don't even think people with a lot of resources when it comes to time and money really do have.
Right.
And, you know, I don't know if God has it in the plans for me to have a lot of resources when it comes to money.
Mm-hmm.
But at least I know that this is something that does not cost me much to give to my kids. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is the real value. Mm-hmm. Because no matter what their environment is going to look like, that will always be valuable. Holding their integrity of self to the highest standard and to the highest priority is, and being able to adjust to their environment is going to get them through whatever, you know, their situation would be. If that is, you know, them off in the world, in space even, if that's an option when they become adults. No matter where they are, that will still prove, I think, valuable.
So here we are wrapping up. I want to thank you for joining us in having some really heavy conversations that I think every human being on this earth needs to have, because we are all beings that will go through trauma, and the real question is, how do we go through it? And for our audience, what we want you to take away from this, and even ourselves in this conversation, is trauma shouldn't be commodified, because when it is, it just leads to more trauma, and we don't need to stay in that cycle. When you define yourself by your trauma, you have to learn how to undefine those aspects of your life that are just a consequence to that pain. Allow yourself to move past it. How do you create your peace after you are no longer defined by that trauma? That's a big one. What does that look like? How do we visualize what peace after pain looks like for us? We're not meant to pass this trauma down. Our experiences are our experiences. They're not meant to be the experiences of the next generation. We're often at fault by creating a space and environment for the next generation by assuming that their experiences will be similar to ours. A point that you made is that we really have to work on flexing our muscle of being able to adjust to the changes in our environments. That, those changes don't necessarily mean that we have to be in the trauma that we have been in. What can we do to learn how to live in those different spaces that don't call for our trauma to be a response to that? And then finally, the question that I think all of us should really ask ourselves, because whether we have kids or not, we play a role in how the next generation handles the world. And how do we prepare the next generation to know themselves, to value themselves, and to know that they have the opportunity to take time to step away from their situation and evaluate what they're going through and be able to say, I am okay, I'm not okay, and what is the next step for me to do? Again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to having another conversation with you all soon.
You are now listening to You Heard.